Good morning, third graders. I hope you guys are doing well. This is Miss Hamilton, and I am here to tell you another wonderful story from our county's history. So we studied a lot about segregation and civil rights. We talked a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. We read a book about him. We talked about Cesar Chavez. We read a book about him. And so I want to talk to you about a story that goes along with the things we learned about those men during that time period in our history. But this story actually takes place in McDowell County, and it takes place in Old Fort. So in 1950, boys and girls, now this was before Martin Luther King Jr. Had even really begun his fight for equal rights. So he had not even begun this yet. So it was in 1950 in September, and people in Old Fort were really surprised one Sunday to look out the window, and they saw this group, this picture you see here, this group of African American children walking up the street with signs protesting. And they were protesting their school being torn down. So at that time, the African American children went to a separate school. They went to, I was trying to see the name of their school, Catawba View Grammar School in Old Fort. And this was an all African American school, and they were going to tear the school down. And so these children were going to have to go to Marion to go to school, which was about a 15-mile distance from where they live now in Old Fort. And back then, that wasn't easy to get there. Not as easy as it is for us now to go from Marion to Old Fort. It was going to be a lot of trouble. Plus, they just didn't want to change schools. They wanted to keep their school. So they were protesting this, walking up and down the streets in Old Fort, which was just really, really brave of them because this was not done back then. You guys know that. We've talked about that a lot. And so even though they did the protest, they still ended up tearing down their school. So now I want to show you. Let me see if I can get to it. This is their school. So we'll see if we can enlarge it a little bit for you. So this is the school that they went to, and the school that was eventually torn down, and they ended up having to go to Marion to go to school. Now, about 5 years later, there came a ruling from the government. There was a court case called Brown versus the Board of Education. And the Supreme Court ruled that it was not legal to separate students, that they should be allowed, African Americans and the white students should be allowed to go to school together. But they said that it was up to the states to decide when to start this and kind of how to do it. So they said it was unconstitutional, which means, it's illegal. It's not, doesn't fit our rights based on the Constitution. But they didn't say when those changes had to happen. And so some of the students decided, and some of the parents decided in Old Fort that they were going to go and try to register some of their students at the Old Fort School. Now, the Old Fort School was still all white school, right? So they wanted to take a group of their students, their children, and try to register them at Old Fort. And so there were certain people, certain parents, I guess, probably, who were supposed to walk these children to the Old Fort School and try to get them registered. Registered means signed up to go to school there. So that morning, here comes the story of the person I want to tell you about. That morning, there was a man named Albert Joyner, and he was a nurse at a hospital up in Asheville, but he had moved to Old Fort. So that morning, he didn't have any kids of his own, but he looked out the window and he saw a group of kids standing there by themselves, these African-American children. The people who were supposed to escort them or walk with them to the Old Fort School, they didn't show up. They were probably scared because they'd been threatened not to do that. Don't try to register your child there. So they didn't show up. So these little African-American children were standing there by themselves. And Mr. Joyner, he thought, that's not right. That's not okay. So he got up, put on his best suit, and he walked those students to the school on August 24th. But now remember, he didn't even have children at the time. But he was doing what he thought was right. Now, I want you to notice something. This picture here is him standing with the superintendent of the schools, okay? And his name, I'm trying to find his name. I don't see his name. Yes, Melvin Taylor, okay? This is Melvin Taylor. This man behind him is Colonel Adams. Now, Colonel Adams was very much in favor of them being able to come to school here. He wanted them to be integrated together. But what I thought was very interesting in this picture, if you will notice how Mr. Joyner is standing. He's got one leg up, his hand on his knee there. He's very relaxed. He doesn't look like he is in a fighting kind of stance. He doesn't look angry. He's just trying to have a polite conversation with the superintendent. But what was interesting to me is if you look at the boy over here kind of to the side of him, I want you to notice how that boy's standing. Do you see that he has the same stance as Mr. Joyner? Got his leg up on that step with his hands on his knees. I think he's copying what Mr. Joyner is doing. Now, boys and girls, I'm just going to stop from the story here just a minute and just give you another little lesson on the side here. Pay attention to the people that you are copying. This boy picked a good person to copy, to do what he's doing, because this man was trying to do the right thing and in the right way. Remember, we talked about how Martin Luther King Jr. did not fight with his fists. He did not fight with violence. And I believe this man here, Albert Joyner, felt the same way. So he was standing up, doing the right thing in the right way. And I believe this little boy back here, I believe he's copying him. I believe he's looking at him and trying to act the way he acts. So a little piece of advice here, boys and girls, is to be careful who you copy. And then really think about the kind of person you're looking at and whether or not they're the person you ought to be copying and trying to be like that person. Just a little bit extra there. But anyway, they did not let them join yet. They told them that they were not going to start the integration yet. Okay? So they were not allowed to put them in there, to put them in school there. Now, it wasn't long after Mr. Joyner did that. He tried to enroll those students that he was out in town, and there was a white man who was a railroad worker, and he actually punched Mr. Joyner and knocked him into the town fountain. Now, why do you think he punched him? I think he probably punched him because he didn't agree with integration. He didn't agree with what Mr. Joyner had done, and he was angry. So he punched him. And Mr. Joyner did not fight back, but they arrested him, and they arrested the other man. Now, Mr. Joyner eventually, he got out of jail and his charges were dropped. They didn't charge him with anything because he didn't do anything. But they did arrest him at first. And Mr. Joyner was threatened. He was intimidated. People tried to scare him, all because he had stood up and did the right thing here for these children. So he's a very important person in our history. But the little kids who started with the protest are very important as well. They did this before a lot of the other protests and fight for integration started. So they were brave to do that. And Mr. Joyner was very brave to do what he did. Now I'm going to give you one more little interesting thing about Mr. Joyner that I thought was just a wonderful, wonderful thing that he said. You remember that I told you that Mr. Joyner was a nurse? Well, years later, Mr. Joyner was still working as a nurse in the hospital. And guess what? The man who punched him was in a serious car accident and was in the hospital. And guess who his nurse was? That's right, Mr. Joyner. He was his nurse. And guess what he did? Do you think he punched him, or do you think he was mean to him, or didn't take good care of him? No, that's not the kind of man he was, is it? He took very good care of that man. But you know what he said he did? He looked him in the eyes. That's pretty important, to look somebody in the eyes. That shows strength and character. He looked him in the eyes and he said, I didn't forget. Now, he didn't say this to the man. He's telling this years later. He said, I didn't forget, and I know that man didn't forget. So they both knew who each other was and what had happened. They didn't forget it. But Mr. Joyner said this. Remember, I said he took good care of him. He wasn't mean to him. Mr. Joyner said this. He said, you don't try to get even with nobody. You do what's right, and you go on. Isn't that a good piece of advice, boys and girls? I think that's part of what makes him so important in our history in McDowell County, because he was a very, very intelligent, caring man who did the right thing, even when it wasn't probably the popular thing, and he got threats and people were mean to him. He still stood up and did the right thing. So I want to encourage you today, boys and girls, to stand up, do the right thing, and find the right person to copy or to be like, just like this little boy looks like he's doing. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, and I hope you have a great day today. Bye.